mistreated by, of course, God's own people. Jeremiah, for example, was thrown into prison on one occasion. He was thrown into a cesspool on another occasion, simply because he was preaching that the people need to quit doing their sinful deeds. Jesus says, I want you to bless. I want you to use your words in the proper way. What's the word bless mean? Sometimes the word bless can be used as a synonym for prayer. It means to ask divine favor. But the word bless can also be used in the sense of giving words of encouragement. The word bless can be used to praise or to compliment someone. Now, think about that. Think about what kind of impact it would have on the other person that has put themselves in a situation where they're your enemy. What impact would it have on them if you complimented them? And I don't mean, boy, Chris, you sure did give me a good bloody nose. I'll give that kind of compliment. But surely there are some things that we could say to the other person that were positive, that were encouraging. Everybody has positive attributes that we could encourage and recognize. And we can say, I don't want us to be enemies. We don't have to be friends. We don't have to be buddies. But I don't want us to be enemies. And then another way that we can use our words, Jesus says, of course, is to pray. Pray for your enemies. It is hard to be enemies with somebody who is encouraging you. It's hard to hate somebody who's saying positive things about you. And it's hard to be enemies with somebody whom you know is praying for you. And you remember last week from Philippians chapter 4 and verse 5, we studied where Paul says, do not be anxious for anything, but with prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And we pointed out that if we don't want to worry about anything, then we need to pray about everything. And here Jesus says, pray for your enemies. Pray that your enemy will have some humility. Pray that your enemy will see what they're doing to people around you. Pray that you yourself will have the right response to them. Pray that you will not be led by their behavior to sin against God. Because if somebody is behaving that way, clearly they're under the influence of Satan. Now they can help it. They can control their behavior. And they may or may not realize that they're being used by Satan to create animosity. So Jesus says, pray for them. Pray that their eyes will be open. Pray that they'll be led to proper understanding. And so these two things here in particular, blessing our enemy and praying for our enemy, causes us to rise above this relationship that is only physical. And it allows us to deal with other people on a spiritual plane. To return kindness to our enemies. And very often it causes them to become our friends instead. And so the cross life responds with positive words. But notice also the cross life responds with positive actions. It's not just a matter of saying, but it's also a matter of doing. First of all, look at what Jesus says in verse 29. Whoever hits you on the cheek, offer him the other also. And whoever takes away your coat, do not withhold your shirt from him either. And your translation might have cloak and tunic, for example. The cloak was the outer garment that they wore at that time for an extra layer of warmth. And the tunic was an inner garment. Sort of like having an overcoat maybe and a sweater, like a Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood kind of sweater. Okay? So Jesus says if they want to take your outer coat, your overcoat, your winter coat, give them your sweater also. If that's what they need. And so Jesus is telling us, don't just love your enemy in words, but love them in action as well. He says here, to love with positive actions. There are some people that follow what might be called the brass rule. The brass rule is the one who says, I am going to seek revenge because you did me evil. For example, David, King David, sent some of his men to Nabal, who was a wealthy sheep herder, and he just wanted a few supplies for his men. He had 600 men, I believe it was. He just needed a little bit of supplies to feed them and to help give them some strength. And he sent his men to Nabal. Nabal, you may remember, embarrassed the men and sent them back to David empty-handed. And David got mad, and he was going to go to Nabal, and he was going to kill Nabal and all of Nabal's men. That's the brash rule. The brash rule says that you did something bad to me, so I'm going to do it back to you. The brash rule says, do unto others as they have done unto you. But that's not the rule that Jesus tells us here, is it? The brash rule is illustrated in the story of Esau and Jacob, and how Esau, he was the oldest son, and Esau should have been given the birthright, but you remember that Jacob instigated his mom, Rebekah. Jacob dressed himself up as he would present himself as Esau. And he came in, and his dad was blind, and he deceived his dad and given him the birthright. And then when Esau comes in and he finds out he's been deceived, remember what Esau wanted to do? He wanted to kill his brother. That's the brash rule. The brass knuckles rule. If you hit me, I'm going to hit you back, and I'm going to hit you harder. But that's not the standard of living that Jesus calls us to. Not seeking revenge. God calls us to let revenge stay in the hands of God. Instead, the Apostle Paul, for example, tells us in Romans chapter 12 and verse 2 that when we have an enemy, we need to do good to them, and we need to heap coals of fire on their heads. Jesus says if somebody hits you on the cheek, now the word for cheek here is actually jaw. So Jesus is not necessarily picturing here somebody who slaps you on the face. Jesus is picturing here somebody who gives you a right uppercut to the jaw. And he says, you turn the other jaw also. And so Paul there says in Romans 12 and verse 20, if you treat people that way, you're going to heap coals of fire on their head. What does he mean by that? They heated by coal, of course, at that time, a type of coal, maybe not the same form that we have today. And so if your enemy comes to your house and he says, my house is cold, my children are cold, my wife is cold, I need some coal, Paul said, you don't just give him a handful, you heap the coal on his head. You respond to your enemy by doing positive good. Give him all the coal he can handle. Jesus is the one who created us. And Jesus knows that a soft answer turns away wrath. And so Jesus says, respond to your enemy as if he's your neighbor. Do good to him. And things will be better in the long run. Nothing will soften a hard heart like a giving heart. Do you think that responding in kind to an enemy is going to make them softer? Do you think responding to your enemy with a hard heart is going to soften their heart? Clearly not. And look at verse 30. Jesus gives us another illustration of this responding in a positive way. Give to everyone who asks of you. And whoever takes away what is yours, do not demand it back. In other words, you are turning your enemy into your neighbor. You are treating your enemy as if he or she is your friend. Seeking revenge, that brash rule, is not what Jesus calls us to do. He doesn't call us to keep score. Jesus' highest desire is the conversion of your enemy. And so if we look at our enemy as God looks at him or her, a soul that is lost in sin and needing the Savior, and that should help us in our response. response. And that's how Jesus could say, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Because he wanted them forgiven in the eyes of God. And so that brings us to the final point, and that is the cross life follows the golden rule. And look how Jesus words it here in Luke chapter 6 and verse 31. Treat others the same way you want them to treat you. Now, there are a lot of people who follow what we might call the silver rule. The silver rule is better than the brass rule, certainly better than the iron rule. The silver rule says you don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. Now, that is probably, for those people who try to live a good moral life, that is probably the rule that is followed by most people. Don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. That's the silver rule. And it's good as far as it goes. Confucius had the silver rule, in essence, at the foundation of his philosophy. We see this illustrated again in the parable of the Good Samaritan. The priest and the Levite who passed by the man who had been beaten by the robbers, they passed by on the other side. They didn't do anything bad to him. They practiced the silver rule. The silver rule is illustrated in the study of Lazarus and the rich man. We see the rich man here who is stuffing his face, and you look through the window there and you can see Lazarus in the background. The rich man did not do anything bad to Lazarus. He didn't steal his money, he didn't cheat him, he didn't extort him, he didn't do anything like that. Didn't do one bad thing to him. He practiced the silver rule. But you see, he could be lazy with the silver rule. The silver rule doesn't require anything of us. It holds us back from doing bad, but it doesn't require anything of us. It doesn't challenge us. It doesn't challenge our patience. It doesn't challenge our love. It doesn't challenge us to live like Jesus Christ. And so Jesus says, I want you to follow the golden rule. Treat others the way you want them to treat you. Solomon had said long ago, Proverbs 3, verse 27, do not withhold good from him to whom it is due when it is in the power of your hand to do so. Do to others. Treat them the way you would want them to treat you. I think of the story of Paul and Silas who were in jail in Acts chapter 16. Just finished studying this passage actually with the Romanians this last week. Paul and Silas had cast an evil spirit out of a girl she was owned by some businessmen, and they used her and the evil spirit that lived in her to predict the future. And they made money off of it. Well, she started following Paul and Silas around as they were preaching in Philippi, and she was saying, these men are preaching through the power of the Most High God. Well, they didn't need the testimony of a demon. They didn't need Satan endorsing them. And so why did Paul cast the evil spirit out of her by the power of Jesus Christ? The problem was, and it's funny that Luke uses the same word, the businessmen's money, source of money, was also cast out. Their source of money was gone. And so these businessmen stirred up the politicians, and they had Paul and Silas thrown in jail. And Paul and Silas were beaten while they were in jail. Now, when Paul was beaten by the Jews, the Jewish law, the law of Moses, limited the number of stripes to 39, 40 minus 1. And if they went over 40, then the ones who were doing the beating were liable under the law to be beaten themselves. So that's why they always stopped at 39, just to make sure they didn't cross the 40 threshold. The Romans had no limitations. The Romans beat Paul and Silas until their arms got tired. And then they were thrown into the inner prison. Their feet were put in stocks and their hands in stocks. And my understanding from my studies is these stocks were in such a way that spread the legs out, where they were in quite a bit of pain and discomfort. And you know what Paul and Silas were doing in prison? Singing and praying. And then after that earthquake, the door